Good to have everyone here tonight. We've got a few that didn't make it back, maybe a little more than we usually have, but it's good, a little more than we usually have that are out, but it's good that you're here. And I went to the nursing home, and Jim Bangs and I and Randy were the only two males there from church, and so Randy, he sings songs that have a lot of bass in them. And then I had to preach, and I thought what he's trying to do is sabotage me to where I'll have a short sermon. So I don't know whether I'll have a short one or not. Depends on if my voice gets stronger. But again, it's good to be here tonight. And singing sounded good at the nursing home. Sounded good tonight. And thank you for singing. Thank you, Randy, for doing it at the nursing home, and Bobby for leading it tonight. And it's good to sing together. I wish we were closer together, but we'd almost have to do like we do on Wednesday night and move y'all to the back. And some people don't want to do that, but I'd like to do that if I had my way. But I won't get my way all the time. But we just need to be closer together or sing out more. And that's the thing that we have. I had turned my hearing aids up. Now I can hear different people. And I know Bobby leading singing. He may be difficult for him to hear different ones to sing. So anyway, it's just the way that it is sometimes, but we're glad that you're here. I'll stop rambling and then preach. I want us to think tonight about the book of Galatians again. This is our second study. Don't know how many lessons we'll have on Galatians. It's a book that's divided and up into certain sections and everything that are a little more difficult than most books to look at, and I'm just in the process of going through and restudying the book of Galatians. I did a lot of reading on it this week and went back and took care of some things that I want to talk about in just a minute. But in this lesson tonight, Paul defends his apostleship. That's what he's doing. He is setting the stage for these people that apparently have said, you're not an apostle. You weren't the apostle with the other apostles, and therefore you must not be an apostle. There could be some that said, well, you're not an apostle because you used to be Saul of Tarsus. And he's going to address that. As we see that tonight, he's going to address the things that went through for his conversion and things of this nature. And so we began tonight by understanding that last week we gave a brief description, introduction to the book, the time. It's either around 48 AD, which would make it the earliest of the New Testament books, or it's later, probably in the mid-50s. I have no idea really which one I choose to look at. But if you look at some listings of the books of the New Testament that are in their supposed chronological order, it's either going to be at the first or it's going to be later on. And so we talked about that. No need to talk about that a lot. The people that it was addressed to is addressed to the region of Galatia that we'll talk about in just a moment. These people had migrated probably from the British Isles. And that back years and years and years ago, back in the BCs, that kind of blew my mind a little bit. They migrated because of the Romans even back then. And then the author, I believe, and there's usually no doubt about this from what I've read, Paul the Apostle is the author, and it's rather unique to his name. The major thing is, Paul said, I marvel that you are so soon removed from the gospel of Jesus. And we're going to see that what they were moving from, and by the way, he said there's not another gospel, what they were removing from the gospel to a form of Judaism and some other things thrown in, as we'll see later on in the book. I had this last week and didn't have it mapped out as well as I wanted to, but Paul visited the region of Galatia on all three missionary journeys. First missionary journey was in Acts the 14th chapter in verses 1 through 21. The second missionary journey begins over in Acts 16:1, and the third missionary journey begins over in Acts 18 verse 23, where he visited the churches there. I think it's interesting because we're going to look at the major places where he visited. And I think it's interesting, we talked last week about northern and Galatia and southern Galatia. There's some debate where he went, but at least Luke gave us that a lot of his work, at least on these missionary journeys, was in southern Galatia. And he visited three main places. Remember that this church is written to a province, not to individual congregations. But he visited, first of all, Antioch of Pisidia. This was the place that Paul visited a lot, Antioch of Pisidia, and the things that he did there. Not to be confused with Antioch of Syria, which was closer to Jerusalem and usually a launching point for some of Paul's work. And then he went from Antioch of Pisidia, and he went to Lystra. And it was at Lystra where Paul was stoned after his first missionary journey in Acts 14 and verse 19. And I reread that, and it's amazing to me that they take him out and they stone him and they leave him for dead. I really think he was dead, but he gets up the next day with Barnabas and leaves. It doesn't say he cripples out, doesn't say he walks out with a cane or anything, but he gets up and he leaves. And some feel like that this is when Paul was called up to the third heaven, or that if he was indeed the man. And then we find where he met Timothy in Acts 16, and then he was in Lystra where he met Timothy according to Acts 16:1, and then he went to Derbe and visited Derbe. So these are the places that Paul went. These where we know where churches are. Well, we want to look tonight for a few minutes about Paul's preaching and Paul's defense of his preaching. I've never had to defend my preaching, I don't think, except maybe one time. I had a man that his name was Thomas Marshall Connor Sr. And I mentioned his son today, who was very instrumental in me being a preacher, Thomas or Marshall Connor, that preached over Osceola. I preached for a little congregation named Boynton. And Marshall Connor's dad, Thomas Marshall Connor, was a debater. He also didn't believe, he believed in the early date of the, not necessarily book of Revelation, but he had weird beliefs on the judgment. That day I preached on the judgment, and it was Boynton, Arkansas. I've talked about Boynton before. I know Brother Connor was aged then, walked with a cane, and he got up after I got done preaching and raised his cane up, Bobby, and he said, "I'd like to answer the young man's speech." I was like 16, 17 years old, or maybe 18. I was young. But my mom and dad, for some reason, happened to drive over from Paragould that day and come to church that morning. And it wasn't my dad that said anything after church. It was my mama that said something after church. And the men there said, "We know you, Brother Connor. You're not going to pick on basically this young boy." And my mama kind of let into him a little bit in a real nice way. And she basically said, "Well, Brother Connor, if you want to come and study with us at our house, you can." He said, "Well, I don't know where you live." And I said, "Your son does." And we kind of went on our way then. But that was the only time probably that I had to give a defense about what I preached. I didn't say a whole lot. Other people spoke up for me, and I was glad. Well, here's Paul. He's having to give a defense for what he preaches. He's having to give a defense for his salvation. He hasn't given a defense for his message. And so he tells them that, number one, my message is not from men, but from God. And we see that in Galatians 1:11, verse 12, and 11 and 12. He said, "For I make known to you, brethren," notice he calls them brothers anyway, "that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man." And I think this is really important for us to understand, for it really fleshes out the rest of the two chapters we're going to talk about. We'll talk on chapter 2 next week. For he said, "For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it." That's important. That's very important. Well, if you didn't receive it from man and you weren't taught it, where'd you get it from, Paul? He tells them, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. Jesus told me. We'll go on and we'll talk about this point a little bit when you go back to what Paul was, and this is the gist of our lesson tonight. You flip over to Ephesians 3 and verse 3. Paul says, how that by revelation He, Jesus, made known to me the mystery as I've already briefly written. Apparently at Ephesus there was a question about Paul's credentials. Paul, where did you go to school? That's what a lot of people say. Paul, where were you taught? Well, Paul said at the fate of Gamaliel, he was very learned in the law. He knew the law, and those around Jerusalem were mystified that he was now preaching contrary to the law, they thought. And so we asked the question, why did Paul remind the people of his former life? And then it could be that he wanted to illustrate that it took a supernatural influence to change Saul of Tarsus to Paul the Apostle. Just think about that. That's where we're developing our lesson tonight. Think about why Paul suddenly said, this is what happened to me. Well, if you go on, we find first of all, if you look at verses 15 and 16 in chapter 1 of the book of Galatians, Paul tells them exactly how it is. Let's break this down. Number one, Paul tells them it wasn't my doing, but God's doing. But when it pleased God. Think about that. Remember the time of Paul's conversion? We'll talk about that again in a moment. Try not to repeat myself, but let's just remember what Acts 9 says, that Paul was going to Damascus having letters from the chief priest and everything. And if I remember the King James text, he was breathing threatenings upon the church. Sounds kind of bad, doesn't it? And that he was going there to imprison both men and women, which was unique in that most of the time when they got people for being Christians, a lot of times they would just go after the men, but they were going after the women in this case. It was then that God decided on the road to Damascus, enough, and Paul, I'm going to call you. But then look what Paul says. When did his call begin? When did God come up with this plan? Who separated me from the mother's womb and called me through grace. Kind of a quandary. Because what do we know of Saul of Tarsus? First time you ever read about Saul of Tarsus is that he is standing there and they lay the clothes, the people that stoned Stephen, they laid their clothes at his feet. And Stephen stoned to death right in front of him. Why didn't God stop that? If he was separated from his mother. Interesting thing. But Paul was destined. Well, did Paul have a choice? Some will look at that and say, Paul didn't have a choice but to become Paul the Apostle instead of Saul of Tarsus. Well, that's wrong too. Because, Paul talked that we have freedom of choice in other places, that God's no respecter of persons and such like, and the things of this nature. And then the purpose of why he separated Paul, to reveal his Son to me, in me. God separated Paul to know Jesus, that I might preach him among the Gentiles. And this is key, and we're going to develop this a little more. He said, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. You read about this in the book of Acts and other places. Remember, it was in Damascus that he was preaching, and they had to let him, the brethren there had to let him over the wall in a basket because the Jews there wanted to stone him to death. But why is Paul going to such lengths? Well, let's look a little bit further. Go over to the book of Acts, and we read that Paul had seen the Lord on the road to Damascus, and it's there that he received his commission to preach. I think it was on the road to Damascus, before I forget to say it, that he received a whole lot. I think the voice that spoke a lot to him. Not all of it's recorded, probably, but we do know that the things are recorded. He heard a lot. And Acts 26, Paul, giving a first-hand account of it, gives more than what Luke did in Acts 9 as he told the story. But let's look at Acts 26. He said, while thus occupied, what was he doing? He was going to Jerusalem to take, or Damascus to take Christians and to bring them back to Jerusalem, probably to be killed, or at least in prison. While thus occupied, as I journeyed to Damascus with authority and commission from the chief priest. Wouldn't it be great if God would keep us from doing evil and call us and occupy us with preaching of the gospel? That's what he did to Paul. He said at midday, well, it was noon, O king, talking to Agrippa, along the road I saw a light from heaven. I think it's unique that Luke records in Paul's words that it's brighter than the sun. Wonder what can be brighter than the sun. I don't know. I don't know if we've ever saw anything brighter than the sun. But Paul did. The people with him did. And it shined around me and those who journeyed with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice speaking to me, saying the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Jesus talking. It is hard for you to kick against the goats. I think that's interesting. It doesn't say it's hard for me to kick against the goats, but it's hard for you. In other words, Jesus wanted to know, Paul, why are you making it so hard on yourself, doing the things that you have? Remember, Paul is learned in the law. And if anybody should have been able to look and to see the things surrounding around Jesus, especially his resurrection, and put everything together, it should have been Paul. Maybe there was a wrestling in Saul of Tarsus about what he was doing. But Jesus asked him the question, why is it hard for you to kick? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. So again, he's talking about the resurrection. He's talking about Saul Tarsus, or to Saul of Tarsus. And Saul of Tarsus said, so I said, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you're persecuting. I wonder what Saul of Tarsus thought. Notice Saul of Tarsus didn't argue with him. Why? Because here is this bright light, brighter than the sun. And Jesus said, get up, stand on your feet. And then Jesus told him, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to make you a minister and a witness both of the things which you have seen and the things I will reveal to you. You wonder what he saw. I think it was probably more than just seeing the light. And he said, I will deliver you from the Jewish people, as well from the Gentiles to whom I now send you. Paul, I'm going to take care of you. Think about that. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to bless you. If you go, part of the things that Ananias was to tell Paul is that, or wanted Paul to know, I'm going to tell you the things you're going to suffer. Paul knew what he was getting into. He knew about all the shipwreck. He knew about all the beating. He knew about all the things he was getting into because God told him, you're going to pay a price. And whether he knew specifically, we don't know, but he knew the price that was going to be paid. Well, let's keep on reading. He said, but arise and stand on your feet, and for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to make you a minister, both of the things which you say and the things that I revealed to you. I will deliver you from the Jewish people as well from the Gentiles, to whom I now send you. And this is what? To open their eyes, just like he had his eyes open, in order to turn them from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan to God. Folks, that's our mission today. We live in a world where people are living in darkness. We need to open their eyes. We need to turn them from the power of Satan to God. Why? That they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those that are sanctified by faith in me. Well, very quickly, let's note the preaching of Ananias. We go back to another account of Paul before Felix, I believe it is, in Acts the 22nd chapter. And Paul said, the God of our fathers, speaking of what Jesus said, the God of our fathers has chosen you that you should know His will. And this is Ananias preaching, and seeing the just one and hear the voice of His mouth. God chose you. For you will be His witness to all men of what you have seen and heard. And he asked, and now why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. Well, that's how you become a Christian. You got to be baptized. We all know that. Paul wanted the people to know his gospel was not from men, but by God. He didn't sit down with anybody and study the open Bible study. He didn't go to a preacher somewhere and say, you know, what must I do to be saved? It's good when people come and ask that. Now, Ananias told him a lot of things we don't know. And Ananias spoke to him about baptism. But when it came to the things that Paul spoke, Paul said, I did not receive it from who? Men, but God. And he's going to come back and deal with this again later on. Well, then let's look at Paul's defense of his apostleship, and the lesson is yours. As alluded to in verse 17 that we read, after Paul's conversion, he did not go to Jerusalem. Well, why is that significant, that he did not go to Jerusalem? Well, there would be those that said, again, you got your gospel second-handed. Remember that it's back at Jerusalem the church is. We don't have many churches that had been established at the conversion of Paul. But the church at Jerusalem, the apostles were there. There was an organized church there, and that they had elders. But it seemed to be the apostles' headquarters. Now this changed in Acts 8 when they went everywhere preaching the word, and so this change was taking place. But again, Jerusalem served as somewhat the hub. Wasn't the headquarters of the church is where? In heaven. A lot of people ask the Church of Christ, where's your headquarters at? Well, it's in heaven. That's where it's at. But the apostles were there. And then during this time, he preached to Christ to the synagogues in Damascus. If you read when he did preach, even some in Jerusalem, and when he preached in Damascus, they couldn't get over it. You Saul of Tarsus. And some of them didn't want to listen to him. Some were scared of him, were afraid of him. I don't know if I had any people ever afraid of me or not. But that's what Paul encountered. And we go to Galatians 1 and verse 17, and he said, nor did I go to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, But I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. So here he made the full circle. And then you go on and you read in verses 18 and 19, and we're going to talk about this a little bit. It said Paul then goes up to Jerusalem for a 3-year period. Paul says that. Look at this in verse 18. And he went up there maybe for the purpose of seeing Peter. Well, why did he want to see Peter? It's a good question, isn't it? There'd be some that say, well, he wanted to see Peter because Peter was the first pope. Now, that's wrong. There is no authority for a pope found in the New Testament. There is a prophecy concerning people that set themselves up as one of God's spokesmen on earth. And the person that does that is said to be a false teacher. Why did he want to see Peter? Probably because Peter was one of the spokesmen in Acts 2. Probably because Peter was instrumental in the church. And we're going to read late next week where he's going to have a run-in with Peter later on down the line. But after 3 years, he went up to see Peter and remained with him 15 days. And this is key to verse 19. But I saw no one other than the apostles except James, the Lord's brother. There are some that believe, and I think erroneously, that this is talking about James of Alphaeus because they're saying, well, you know, we don't have any account of an apostle, of the Lord's brother being an apostle. Well, again, time had taken place. This is later on, just a few years. But he said in his own words, directed by the Holy Spirit, that I saw none of the other apostles except who? James, the Lord's brother. So what do we believe? Well, I want to believe that it's what it says. Well, here's the things that we really don't know. Number one, it's unknown when this period was. We know that it was after 3 years, but 3 years from what? Number two, it does not appear to be the one mentioned in Acts 9, where Paul went and preached in Jerusalem as introduced by Barnabas to Peter, and then he was introduced by Peter and the apostles in Acts 9:26, unless James is the only one that he saw. But it's hard to believe that Barnabas said, I'm going to take you to the apostles, and he gets there and James is the only one. And so again, if you look at it and scratch your head a little bit, maybe you'll get it. That's what I've been doing on this particular idea. But what is the point of all this? What do we want to make? Well, it's the same thing that Paul wanted to make. He did not need to meet the apostles to get his sermons. He got what he preached through God, through Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. And that's the whole image right here that Paul wants to convey. Well, very quickly, let's look at verses 21 through 24. Paul then gives his history after his 15-day stay in Jerusalem. Paul went to Syria and Cilicia and remained unknown by the faith. Let's read what he says. He said, afterward I went to the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was unknown by the face of the churches of Judea which were in Christ. Well, why is that significant? Well, the Judean brothers didn't tell me what to preach. And if you go and follow the story, you had where eventually he is going to go to Jerusalem because they're hearing about all these preaching. They're hearing all about his baptism. But he says, not this time. He's giving defense of the gospel. Verse 23, but they were hearing only, he who formerly persecuted us now preaches the faith which he once tried to destroy, and they glorify God in me. Well, why did we go to such lengths? And this is the lesson. Well, it's to the heart and the core of the book of Galatians. The things that Paul is going to tell them, he wants them to know these are from God. And he wants them to know, and he's trying to put to rest once and for all this thing about his apostleship. I am an apostle, not from men, but by God. The gospel that you are leaving is the gospel that I received, not from men, but God. Well, next week we're going to talk about Peter a little bit and flesh this out, and then we're going to get into the meat and the heart of the book of Galatians. If you need to come tonight, the lesson is yours. Won't you come as we stand and sing?
Someday you'll stand up to the long time. Someday your record you'll see. Someday you'll answer the question of life. What will your answer be? What will it be? What will it be? Wherever you spend your eternity. What will it be? Oh, what will it be? What will your answer be? Sadly you'll stand here unprepared, trembling you'll fall on your knees, facing the sentence of life or of death. What will that sentence be?